And so the thing we want to talk about here, the three sort of classes of things I want to talk about are choosing your question format, how participants are going to answer it. We'll talk about principles of survey wording, how you word the questions, and then other things you can do to promote honest responses from your participants because sometimes they are not. So when choosing a question format, there, nowadays are a lot of different varieties of these, but the four primary ones boil down to this. The first kind is open-ended, and an open-ended response is when respondents can answer however they want. So it is a open-ended question in the sense that there are no response options, and they can just write or speak whatever's on their mind. You can also get forced choice responses. In a forced choice response, participants or the respondents are going to make a response to a limited number of options. So, we'll show you some examples of this in a minute here. But anytime you get a survey question, if you've taken one where it says, please select one or select all that apply, that's sort of a forced choice question. And honestly, one of the choices is none of these apply, so you do have that option, but there's no option for you to add in your own thing typically, and you have to choose from what's there. Very common in psychology, we'll get Likert scale items. So these are specifically designed questions, usually on a scale of like 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, where participants are going to agree or strongly disagree about a given statement you're making. And so you give the statement, and then the respondent writes down a number that corresponds to how much they agree with that statement on this numerical scale. And again, we'll show you some examples of that in a minute. The final one, which you don't see in research very often, but you can see in versions of surveys out in the world or on the internet specifically, are when respondents rate an object on a numerical scale, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with agreement. Very specific to the Likert scale items, you're specifically given a prompt, which is a statement which you're asked how much you agree with. Here, you're not given that prompt, and so you're going to get a lot more variability or variety in the kinds of ways people are asking about that. So as an example of an open-ended question, we might be interested in demographic information like what is your ethnicity? And to phrase this open-endedly, we could just say, what is your ethnicity? And you could write it in. Okay, that's very simple. In contrast, we could do a forced choice thing where I give you a bunch of options and you get to check all that apply. And so I list them all out here. And again, you can prefer not to answer. You can say none of these, something else. That's sort of a nuance here where you can type in your own thing or any of these other ones. And so if you're just thinking about this right now, you can probably consider like, this forced choice is going to be easier to score. It's going to be easier to put into numerical format to analyze later for, saying or making statements like 25% of my population was black, 15% was white, so on and so forth. So that's nice. That's one of the advantages of that. And as we'll talk about in a second, we like numbers when we can get them. So this is a good one. But one of the disadvantages of doing this is that you really want to do, you really only want to do open-ended questions if you're not sure of all of the response options. And so here, you could make the argument that maybe we shouldn't ask it this way because this is not all of the response options. However, this is sort of, in this specific example, dealt with the item second from the bottom, where you are allowed to write in your own thing. So it's a bit of a hybrid here. As an example of a Likert scale item, you would get a statement like, I see myself as dependable and self-disciplined. This would be something from like a personality test. And all you would do as the respondent is rate it on the scale of 1 to 5. Sometimes it's 1 to 7. In this case, it's 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree, 3 is neutral, and 5 is strongly agree. And usually when people do surveys, you're going to get a bunch of these. You're not just going to get one, you'll get a bunch of different questions like this. And with the differential format, which I talked about previously, again, you're not going to see this a lot in psychological research because measurement is important, as I've sort of emphasized in previous chapters. And so although it's on a numerical scale, there's a lot more issue, or researchers have a lot more issue with how people interpret these scales. But as an example, right, you go to a restaurant and OpenTable wants you to rate the restaurant on a scale of 1 to 10, or your Uber driver, you rate your Uber driver for how many stars they get. It's not clear like what a 1-star means. It's not clear what a 5-star means. Might mean different things to different people. So there oftentimes aren't labels there. And there's not a clear prompt here where it says, rate how much you agree with the following statement. My Uber driver did really well. So they tend to be more general. They're a little bit harder to interpret numerically because of the sort of vagueness of it and how differential it can be from person to person or situation to situation. Nevertheless, you generally know how to interpret something like this if you see it for a product review on Amazon or a movie review, something like that. People have a generally good sense of what it means, but it's not particularly well suited for research. And so the first thing we sort of talk about is, well, what's best? And what's best depends. So as I mentioned earlier, generally closed-ended questions we like. So that would be forced choice, Likert, and this sort of differential questions. They're almost always preferred. The reason why is they're easier for statistical analysis, and they give the experimenter more control. Both of those make storytelling around the data a lot easier. So when you can do that, and it's not going to hurt, at least in your opinion, the reliability or validity of what you're asking about or the construct you're interested in, then you should try to do that. That being said, that's not always going to work. Sometimes it won't work, and so in those situations, open-ended questions are best. Especially if you're going to ask about the frequency of behavior, that's a good time to do it. I remember taking a survey about risky behavior, maybe my first year in college or something like that. I don't exactly remember what it was, but they were asking a question about like, how many drinks do you have per week? And there were boxes there. It was forced choice. It was like 0, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 plus. And I remember doing what most people would do in that situation, which is counting up the drinks you had that week. And it was over 7. And but I was thinking to myself, like, that wasn't a terribly bad week. Like I never really had too much. They were sort of spread out over the week. But on the scale that you gave me, it makes it seem like I got like a problem, and I don't. So I do what a lot of other people do is I went down to like 3 to 4 because I felt that best represented who I was relative to my peers and not what I actually did. And if people are doing that with your survey, you got a problem because now you're not getting accurate information. You're getting people's feelings about where they think they are relative to their peers, and that's not good. That means your survey is not going to work well. So if you don't know the frequency of a behavior, or at least you don't want to list those because you're worried that people might view those questions now as like, where do I want to be there? Then you leave it open-ended. And if you leave it open-ended, someone's going to honestly, or be more likely to honestly count up their drinks and say, yeah, this is what I had, and they're more willing to write it down because now they don't know where that stands relative to everybody else. And so they have no reason to change that behavior because they don't know if that's low or high or in the middle. So they'll just be honest with you. And as I was also mentioning earlier, if you don't know the best responses for a forced choice question, or you don't know all of the responses for a forced choice question, then that's a really good situation where you also just want to leave it open-ended. A lot of times in research scenarios, there will be multiple versions of a survey, and the first version of a survey will have an open-ended question. They'll get a big sample, they'll analyze those responses to the open-ended questions, and use that information to turn them into a forced choice question on a later survey. So again, survey research can take time, and this is one of the reasons why, is because it takes surveys to figure out what the forced choice options should be on a future survey. So there's layers to this. But generally speaking, if you don't know the best options, keeping it open-ended is the way to get the most reliable and valid data.